From the book of Mark, chapter 12, verses 28 through 31. One of the teachers of the law came and heard the debating. Noticing that Jesus had given them a good answer, he asked him, "Of all the commandments, which is the most important?" "The most important one," answered Jesus, "is this: Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. The second is this: love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these." The second reading is from Matthew chapter 5, verses 43 through 46. "You have heard that it was said, 'Love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that?"
Thank you. So today we are wrapping up a series where we have been asking the question, should Christians be good citizens? And one of the reasons that I put this as the last sermon in the 7 series is because I wanted to proceed and say, should Christians be good citizens, without defining what it means to be a Christian. But today I want to just ask the question, not what does it mean to be a good citizen, which is what we've been talking about, but what does it mean to be a Christian? You can't answer the question, should Christians be good citizens, if you don't know what makes somebody a Christian. So I want to propose to you that what makes someone a Christian is not just praying a prayer one time at camp or being baptized as a kid or a teenager. It's not even believing maybe the right things like the Apostles' Creed or reading the right Bible a certain amount of times a month. It's not belonging to the right church. That what makes someone a Christian, I want to propose to you today, are 4 loves. These 4 loves that Jesus talked about. When Jesus talked about love, he talked about it in 4 directions. He said, love your neighbor as yourself. So he's assuming that you love yourself. That's 2 loves. And how you show that you love God is by loving your neighbor. So those are all tied together. And then he went, as Jesus often did, and raised the bar. He raised the standard and said, and love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. So I'm going to suggest to you today that these 4 loves are what makes somebody a Christian. That this pattern of 4 directional love is what indeed patterns us, forms us to the image of Christ, and conforms us to God's will. To love God is to love your neighbor as you love yourself, and to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Those 4 directions of love shape us as Christians. They reform our mind, they transform our world, and they inform how we interact with the society around us. So I think that if somebody did these 4 loves, they would actually be a pretty good citizen, no matter what country they were a part of. If they were in a democracy like ours, or if they were in, say, a system like in China, or if they were in a very different non-democratic system, that these 4 loves make somebody a very good citizen. But I'm going to make the case for us in North America, as part of a democracy, that these patterns of directional love shape and guide us, because if you think about it this way, somebody who loved their neighbor as they loved themselves would do something very interesting, which is that when they went to the ballot box, when it was that one day every several years where we vote, they would not vote only for their own self-interest, but that they would indeed use their agency to vote in ways that benefit people who were very different than them. So that would be very interesting if people didn't vote only for that which benefited themselves, right? But for those who were maybe marginalized, or maybe who were disenfranchised and not part of the system, maybe those who had different limitations or systemic pressures that impacted their concrete lived reality. And instead of only voting on ways that benefit me and my neighborhood, voted in ways that could transform neighborhoods that I don't frequent that much, right? Because the concern would be for someone other than myself. So that would be an interesting way to be a citizen. But I think what really transforms this idea of this fourfold love is the love of enemy. I don't know if you've picked up on it, but we live in a time where in our politics, we're very divided. Partisan politics is at an all-time high. Congressional gridlock, paralysis, right? Media saturation. And people are there's a lot of animosity in a culture of conflict. This argument culture, we are part of an enemy-making machine. And we are little gears and cogs who are caught up in this beast of a system that rolls over any resistance on its way to creating an us versus them, right versus wrong, left, right, Democrat, Republican divide. What would it mean to love your enemy across that political divide? I'm going to go even further today. I'm going to suggest that if you don't love your enemy, you may not be a Christian. That's a pretty radical statement. Because some of you will say, how dare you, sir? I believe all of the right things. I can quote the Apostles' Creed by heart. I know most of the books in the Bible, I think. I might be able to name half of the apostles. But the thing with this Jesus way is that Jesus says it's not enough for you to love people who you agree with and love people who are like you. Everyone does that. You know who does that? Lawyers. You know who else does that? Nurses and English teachers and sex workers. Everyone does that. Methodist ministers do that. Stay-at-home moms do that. Everyone does that. That's not the Jesus way. Jesus calls us to a higher standard. To love your enemies is that which transforms you from being a member of any other denomination or religious tradition. This thing of enemy love is unique in some ways to this Jesus way. And this is why I am fascinated with people who no longer want to call themselves Christians because they think that the word has taken on too much baggage. And so there's this very large movement out there of people who are, say, post-Christian or post-faith or ex-evangelical is another one. Sort of, I'm over that. I know I was raised that way, but I've moved on. I want to leave it behind. And I actually get that. Actually, I applaud that. I think there should be fewer Christians. I know it's a weird thing for a minister to say, but actually, when we are a smaller minority, it actually makes the light that we shine more profound in the culture around us. To quote Kierkegaard, when everyone's a Christian, no one's a Christian. So I don't mind if people say, hey, I was raised this way, but I'm good. I'm going to move on. I don't think that that's the worst thing in the world. But the people who really intrigue me, who capture my imagination, are people who say, I no longer identify as a Christian, I'm a Jesus follower. They freak me out. Have you tried following Jesus? Because if you have to do what Jesus did and follow Jesus in what he said, that's way harder than being a Christian. One of the reasons that I love being a Methodist is that it comes with a card. It's like a gym membership. You don't actually have to go, right? It's like you belong to a gym, so you don't actually have to go and work out. That's one of the benefits. You belong to a gym. That's one of the reasons I like being a Methodist, so I don't have to follow Jesus. Many of you don't like when I say this, by the way. But let me tell you why it rings so true for me. I have some friends, Edith and Randy, who no longer identify as being Christians. They follow Jesus. They're Jesus followers. And I said, you know, guys, I got to be honest with you. I find it far more difficult and far more challenging to actually follow Jesus than to just call yourself a Christian and sort of cognitively, intellectually believe the right things. But the thing about Edith and Randy is that they love their enemies. And as native peoples, they think that the term Christian has acquired way too much baggage. But they do want to follow Jesus, who said, I am the way and the truth and the life. And so they walk the Jesus way and live the Jesus life. And it sounds really hard because I have struggled to love these 4 different ways that we are called to. I'm not sure how good I am at loving God, if I can be quite honest. I mean, there are days I'm not sure how much I believe in God all the time. And that haunts me. There are days I don't love my neighbors. I know that. I don't know most of my neighbors' names. And in COVID, I haven't had a chance to be close to them and serve them and network like I used to. I'll bet most people don't know in my neighborhood. I bet they don't know my name, and they probably don't know I'm a Christian. There are days I don't really love myself all that much. And to be honest, I haven't had the greatest opportunity to love my enemies. I sort of just mock them from a distance. So if these 4 loves are what calls us to be a Christian, and indeed patterns us and makes us a Christian, I'm not sure how great of a job I've done on any of the 4. So it actually is far easier for me if I could be a card-carrying Methodist or a card-carrying Christian, and I didn't have to worry about following Jesus. Actually doing what Jesus said and following Jesus in what Jesus did is way harder than going to church and saying some nice words and believing some cool things in your heart. This thing about loving your enemy is transformative. It is a different way of being in the world. So should Christians be good citizens is actually a lot tougher of a question to answer, not because of the citizen question, but because of the Christian question. Should Christians be good citizens? It's actually, once you get the Christian issue settled, the answer is obvious. Yes, Christians will be good citizens. No matter what country they live in, they will be good citizens because they won't vote only for their self-interest, and they will reach across the political aisle to love their enemy and to partner for the greater good. That part's easy. Becoming a Christian's the tough part. These 4 loves, that's the high standard. Once you clear that, being a citizen, that's cake. getting over the hurdle of loving your neighbor and loving your enemy. That seems to me to be the real challenge. What say you? What do you think about this idea of the four loves? I would love to hear your concerns, your questions, your pushback. What do you think? Siglinda, can I bring you a microphone? Thanks. I want the Zoom folks to be able to hear you too.
It's very brief and not profound at all, but when you said what makes a Christian, my first thought went to love your neighbor as yourself. I think that's the big message that Jesus has. And loving your neighbor sounds pretty easy, but I think you're right. The loving your enemy is a really tough part.
Yeah.
And something that I know I don't.
Yeah.
But, and sometimes I just avoid thinking about it, but should spend more time on.
Can you take the microphone to Mary? You know, I was really challenged by a quote that I can't now remember who said it, but I think it was a Native American leader. When they asked him if he was a Christian, he said, "I don't know, you'll have to ask my neighbors." And I think if you are what other people think you are, that would be a more interesting way to decide if you were a Christian, is if other people thought you were. To put yourself in their hands. Mary Turk?
I don't have an answer. I have a question.
Yeah.
Who do we consider our neighbors?
Yeah. Well, do you want the Jesus answer?
Yes.
Oh, everyone.
So that includes our enemies.
That does include your enemies. Yeah. Yeah. It's a pretty high standard, right?
Very. And that includes the Russians,
Yes.
Vladimir.
Yeah. Any other comments or questions, thoughts?